Psychotherapy Stripped Bare, up next on Carpe Diem. Hello and welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Crystal Acosta. Joining me today are the authors of a new psychological case study book, Bare, Psychotherapy Stripped. Bare gives a first-hand look at a psychologist and her internal thoughts and reasoning as she sits down with her patients and helps them work through their treatments. No two patient stories are the same, but somehow she finds a way to connect one to another. The book breaks down the wall between patient and doctor because the authors include so much of the protagonist's internal struggles and how they are reflected in her own patient's therapy. Whether it's love, fear, rejection, abandonment, or death, readers live through the traumas of the patients as if they were the psychologists. Joining me now are the authors themselves, Dr. Jacqueline Simon Gunn and Carlo DiCarlo. Welcome, Jackie and Carlo.
Hi. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So first off, Jackie, what is psychotherapy? Is it a type of science?
I consider psychotherapy an art. Psychology is a social science, and the psychotherapy is an application of psychological theories to helping people. So it's an understanding of human behavior, but because you can't measure it in the same way, and there's so much gray area and you need to be flexible and creative, I consider it more of an art. There are people that would disagree with me, but I would say it's more of a creative process.
And Carlo, from a writer's perspective, what would you say psychotherapy is to you?
I agree with Jackie. It is a very creative process. Having been in therapy, you can't really measure what's going on between a patient and the doctor, and the doctor has to have some kind of flexibility, some kind of creative approach to what they're doing. Otherwise, it's very cut and dry, and the patient almost seems like an inanimate object. This
book is based on, Jackie, your patients. Mm-hmm. How did you two come together to create it together? How do you fit into it?
Want to take?
We've been friends for over 20 years, and so we had talked about writing a book together years ago and a few times had outlines, and then I had self-published another book in 2010, which Carlo had offered to edit, but the book had already been edited. So then when I started writing this book, he offered to edit the book, and with his experience as a writer and just having someone to brainstorm ideas with, once he started editing, so when I wrote the book, each case was separate, so it read like an individual story, almost like a book of short stories. And when Carlos started going over what I had given him, he thought it could read like a novel, so it would be in the genre of nonfiction novel, which sounded really exciting to me. And so he then became more involved in rewriting over my rights to kind of, you know how it flows like a story. It flows like a novel. It has a plot and a climax and a resolution. That's where Carlo came in. Because although I've been writing forever, I have no experience as a creative writer, but I happen to really enjoy writing narratives. And so he helped me.
Yeah, I think after, when you first asked me to edit, she had given me the first half of case study, the main one test that follows through the whole book. And I did some just minor copy editing and some editorial notes, and I did some rewriting. And after that, and I gave her some ideas about where to go with it, and that's when I think you decided that you'd rather me actually write it with you than just edit. And then that's when we sat down and started talking about what kind of patients to include and what we could do with the book. I think you wanted it to really be something more than her first book.
I wanted it to be more riveting because that's what I wanted the reader to have the experience, which I think in The Therapist Chair, which is the first book, the accounts are vivid, but because they're written, they're shorter, they're less involved. And I reveal a lot about my thoughts and feelings, but I don't really go into anything in my own life and how it applied and the back and forth. That I wanted to give readers that experience, both for people in the field and then for people outside of the field. I thought it could hopefully be inspirational in providing, like we had discussed before, some truth about living that I think we as people, as psychotherapists, are privy to that inside look into people's motivations and drives and what really goes on in people's minds that's not discussed. It's just not proper etiquette to discuss. That I wanted people to have to know what that was like, and that hopefully it would help them on some level just by identifying with that process.
Well, I know me personally, when I read the book, I would read your therapy session with the patient, and you write about what goes on in your mind as you're listening to the patient, and you come to conclusions about what's wrong with them or what they're going through, but they haven't seen that yet on their own. And you go through this struggle of it seems like you want to say it, but you have to hold back. Mm-hmm. How do you hold back from not telling them what they need to see and having them see it themselves?
I think doing that is a huge beginner's error, because what happens, I guess the short answer to your question is just training, because one of the first things you learn when you're training to be a psychotherapist is that timing is everything. The timing of what you say, especially in interpretation, which is something that I'm thinking in my mind, that I'm extrapolating from what I'm hearing and what I'm observing in someone's behavior and comportment. If I say it before they're ready to hear it, then it's not going to either make any sense. It could force people to leave treatment even. It could be too threatening. So the timing of that is vital. And that's one of the first lessons I learned in my training. Holding back on it sometimes is really hard, because it's so exciting to figure all that out and piece it together and realize if the patient came to that conclusion, they might be relieved of their suffering. So, the mistake one might make, not that I analyze my friends, but if I saw that in a friend and I might say it and then they brush me off like, Jackie, that's, not what happened. I can do that. But in the therapy room, I have to really think about where the person's at and how they might respond to the interpretation at that time.
There's actually a case that is briefly mentioned, Mary,
yeah,
where she leaves therapy prematurely because she thinks that Jackie's already jumping to the conclusion that Jackie hasn't even mentioned yet.
Although it's complicated, because in my mind I was, but people pick up, there's an intuition that goes back and forth, and depending on the intuitive capacity of the particular patient, I can remember very early in my training having a patient that was on the verge of tears multiple times about a death, and I was young and very inexperienced, and I did not want her to cry. Now, I never announced that in the room. I never said, please don't cry. But I think it was so profound for me, like the anxiety that she was going to cry over this loss and then I might cry with her. I might just lose it. That my body language, there's this like reciprocity that goes back and forth, this unspoken dynamic, and she never cried. And I'd go to my supervisor, she needs to cry. I don't know why she's not crying. And then being an astute supervisor, he had said, well, what's going on for you? And I said, well, I don't want her to cry. I'm scared. And breaking that down for me with my supervisor and then going back into the room more open, eventually she did cry. It's complicated.
And I just want to go back, because you had mentioned before a a character, I can't really say character, a patient in the book, and it goes into what we're talking about now. You mentioned Tess. There was, throughout the book, you open the book with Tess, you end the book with Tess. She pops in throughout the whole entire book. And that internal struggle, there's certain times that she says things and you want to jump out and tell her something, or she makes you feel away, but you hold back because you know she's not ready to hear it, or she's not, I don't want to say strong enough to hear it, but she's not at that point yet. Can you describe more Tess and her backstory?
I feel like it might be two questions. I just want to be clear. You're asking about how I held back when I relate to her, or do you want to hear more?
Talk to me more about who Tess is, and then how you were able to hold back until she was ready to hear some of the things she needed to hear.
I mean, I really see Tess as someone who has, although she at the time of the book is 61 years old, I don't think that her issues are that different from a lot of people in general. She's aging. I think it's twofold. I think she grew up in a house. I think she was incredibly beautiful, still beautiful, but in youth, such attention to her looks that became her whole identity. And although she has superior talents in so many other areas, that was never acknowledged or fostered. And so she had to work so hard to maintain that appearance. And when that was taken away by her surgery, she lost her, it was such a loss that her identity vanished in that sense. And she struggles to get it back, and she doesn't know how. On a larger sense, it's a societal issue, which I hope comes across in the book, because it's something I feel I've been affected by and something I've talked about in my own therapy. Clearly something I'm pissed about, because I go into that in the book. And I think the larger sense of that is Tess is in a world where youth is seen as an advantage, and people are doing outrageous things to stay looking young, even if they're not being young, to look young. And that's her story, and that's where the conflict between her and I come in. There's so much similarity in many ways, both being petite, we're both Jewish. And even though we dress very differently, there's some, like I wear big rings, she wears big rings. There's some similarity that I think really provoked her, and she really didn't want me to suffer the same as she. If somehow she could help me not suffer as her, then she would relieve her own suffering. Although I don't suffer the way she does. I mean, in some ways, yes, because I am an aging woman as well, but I am grateful that I can recognize that I have other things to offer besides my appearance. I'm trying to give that to her, and so we're going back and forth. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that definitely comes across in the book. You could see, because she's, I would say, probably the character or the patient that's mentioned the most, and that you talk about other patients, and then somehow it always just comes back to Tess, or something that Tess ties into it in a way, or it makes you feel a way, something with another patient sparks something that Tess might have said. But also there's an array of other patients, and I noticed that most of your patients, the stories take place either around the same time or at the same location, but there's one patient that pops in here and there that was a whole nother time in your life, and his name was Ralph. And he was a young kid, I believe, who just grew up, I guess, on the wrong side of the tracks, was abandoned by his parents. Can you talk more about him and his story?
I hope I could do that without crying. I don't know why I'm reading Ralph's story still. It's very, I really, well, I was a much less experienced therapist. I was still in training for my doctorate, so I was close to the end of my doctorate, but not completed. And so obviously, 14 years younger, 13 years younger than I am now, so that's 13 less years experience. He was in a locked facility. He had killed people, but yet there was something very vulnerable about him. Now, before I worked at juvenile detention, I had worked in some forensic settings, so I wasn't unfamiliar with what it's like to work with a court-stipulated patient, which I think helped me understand how different he was than a patient that comes in on their own volition. One of the things that I think for anyone who's trying to understand and empathize with someone from an inner city is that it's an entirely different culture. And so whereas there was resistance with Ralph, like he had trouble telling me his innermost feelings, I'd be trying to pull that out in my private practice. I'd be trying to like figure out how to get someone to really experience the depth of their feelings and be able to share them with me. But with Ralph, I knew that that's not safe, because if Ralph does that and he goes back on the street, he'll be killed. So part of that is a cultural sensitivity to inner city living and what it was really like for him. And then there's all the complexity of him just being this amazing kid born into horrible circumstances. His awareness of it, because he's like so intelligent, and his journal telling that story of the crying boy feeling abandoned and wanting his family, juxtaposed to the, you know, kind of delinquent gang member exterior. It was very, very intense, and he brought that out in all the mental health professionals that came in contact with him. He's really exceptional. And I don't know, for some people reading the book, I don't know, I wonder what their feelings will be for me to be talking about how he told me of some of the murders he committed, and to still really empathize with him. But
yeah, because he had some pretty heavy stuff happen to him, and he witnessed a lot of heavy things going on. And I felt reading the book, all you showed was sympathy for him. And you're always there for him. Even when you couldn't be there, you wanted to be there. And you state that in the book. But Carlo, you know, all these patients, they're Jackie's patients, they're her stories that she shared with you. When you read the original manuscript from story to story, what was your thought process? Because you weren't there for these, and now you're reading all these stories.
Well, I could definitely relate to the stories. I saw myself in a lot of what each of the patients were going through, and it was when I was doing rewrites. What I really did was expand the story, really go into the details and the depth of what was going on, and I would help bring out more of what transpired in session. But I found it as much a cathartic process as it probably was for the patients. I remember getting emotional when I was writing things about Tess and about the Tony and Raoul story, even the Sam story. I saw myself in a lot of that, and it was, it's very moving. Sometimes funny and sometimes really touching, and I would get choked up sometimes. It was an incredible experience to work on it with her. And it was.
And you mentioned some other patients. Sam was another one that stood out for me, because I felt Sam's character reflected a lot of you. Because you were a runner, and Sam was a runner hoping to end up to the Olympics, and she had to come for therapy because she was going through an eating disorder, and she wasn't meeting, I guess, her weight limit to continue training. And her story is a little different than your other patients, because she went to therapy for a shorter period of time. You do long-term therapy, and she only had about a few months window before she had to go to the Olympics. Can you explain more about that whole session and how that differed from every other patient you've seen?
Well, in a short-term therapy, you have to find out one problem. In a long-term therapy, you're trying to look at the whole person, everything in there. I mean, people usually come in with one problem, even if it's not the thing like you learned in the book. They may come in with one thing and it's really something else that's brought them in, but they're not even aware of it. But in a short-term therapy, you don't have time for that. It's, let's focus on one thing. And in Sam's case, it was what's going on that's causing her not to meet these really exceptional goals, and how can I help her? And I guess very early on, I start to realize that's not really the question. The question is, what does Sam want? Which in some ways, and of course, since I'm the therapist, there are going to be similar themes because you can't totally ever separate who you are as a person and what you've learned in your own therapy and life experience from how you see helping people. But thematically, the question for Sam is the same question I have for myself, which is the same question for most of the patients, maybe Ralph being an exception, but which is who are you apart from what other people's expectations are of you, and what do you want for yourself? What's going to give your life meaning, not make everyone around you happy, which ultimately is the question for Sam, and there is a resolution, and it's short, which makes that story very satisfying because there is a question, the question's answered, and there's a resolution. Right. So,
I think that the thing that really worked for Sam, also being a short term, was that she was open to what needed to be done. She was prepared to face what her problems were and to fix them.
That's true. Yeah.
And it was the fact that it was a quick case really juxtaposed what was going on with Tony too. Someone who was in total denial of what his problems were in his life and how to solve them. While he put a veil across that, Sam almost immediately was willing to lift that veil and really work on what the issues were.
I think a simultaneous issue that comes up in the case of Sam, which again, I don't know, I think everyone's interpretation the book will be a little different, is sort of just the different paths that life can take and how we make a decision and we don't realize how largely that decision will impact future decisions that become available to us. So as I'm watching Sam, live out this dream that might have been mine, there's cause for reflection there, that I believe that most people have. We all have crossroads what to do, and trying to figure out what to do and what are the implications later on.
And it's crazy because you said first that you originally wrote it story by story, patient by patient, and then you came in and you put it in this world that the patient's stories intertwine with each other, but they're not the same. No two stories the same. How did you get to that point and find the connection that you could link each little piece by piece?
It was certainly a puzzle to put together, but it was kind of exciting. I really looked for what the connecting factors were, what the timelines were. For the most part, I think the timelines stayed pretty much what they were. As you know, with case studies, details are changed. Some facts are changed to hide the patient's identity.
Yeah.
But I really worked to find what the similarities were. Or sometimes the juxtapositions, like I mentioned about Sam and Tony. We discussed in the book they made good links, good bridges between the cases. That while Sam was having success, it was easy to then discuss where Tony was lacking or where Tess was lacking. And I would find those kinds of similarities or contrasts to bridge the stories.
I think a few times where there wasn't a bridge, he then called me and asked for specific. In fact, Ralph wasn't even in the book to begin with.
No, it wasn't. But I was looking for something else to really bridge.
And we had been roommates when I was in graduate school in Miami, so he knew that I worked in juvenile detention, and he said, "Do you have the story from that time?"
I actually think I remembered
You might have.
a couple, yeah. You would never really go into details, but sometimes. But I remember you talking about Ralph. You never mentioned his name, but there was this one patient who was really, who everyone on the staff really took a liking to, and You actually said to me, what if we took him in as a foster child? I'm like, I don't know about that. I don't know if we can deal with that. Not for any reason except that we were both in kind of a transitional.
Yeah, I
Partner
was a grad student. I
Right.
mean, it couldn't happen.
No.
You keep mentioning the patient Tony. The next step from after you guys release this book, I know you're working on a screenplay.
I'm working on a screenplay. I've been writing screenplays for a number of years and trying to make some headway in that field. And I saw that Tony's story really lends itself to screenplay. It's a very visual medium. So so I've gotten the first draft finished on it, and I'm going back and doing rewrites. And then hopefully we'll
Can you
get somewhere with
give
it.
us a brief, I guess, description without giving too much away about Tony's storyline?
Well, Tony has relationship issues. He's living a dual life. He really wants to. He says he wants to settle down. He wants to satisfy his family's expectations, but he's really got other expectations for himself that he wants to do, but he
holds back.
He really holds back, and even to himself.
And that definitely
So-
comes across in the book. And I guess the readers are really going to enjoy reading that story and other stories. But unfortunately, we ran out of time. But if you'd like more information about Bear Psychotherapy Stripped, visit Dr. Jacqueline Simon Gunn's website, drjacquelinegunn.com. I want to thank you guys for coming on the show. For more information about Carpe Diem, you can write to us at the email address on your screen, carpediem@mail.montclair.edu, or call us at 973-655-5158. For Carpe Diem, I'm Crystal Acosta. Thanks for watching.